This is not a story about generosity. It is a story about what happens when generosity meets mathematics. Sweden. For decades, the country that defined humanitarian immigration in Europe. The nation that took more asylum seekers per capita than any other EU member state. A country where openness was not just policy, it was identity. It was how Sweden understood itself. A moral superpower. A safe harbor. The one country in Europe that would never close its doors. While other nations debated quotas and border fences, Sweden opened its arms. It was not just accepting refugees. It was building a national identity around the act of acceptance itself. Today, that same country offers immigrants up to 350,000 Swedish kroner, roughly $34,000, to leave. Not as punishment, not as deportation, as incentive. A check signed by the state to encourage voluntary departure. The previous cap for an entire family was 40,000 kroner. The new amount is nearly 9 times higher. This is not a symbolic gesture. It is a financial strategy to reverse the flow of people. This is not hypocrisy. It is a system correcting itself, and the correction tells you more about Sweden than the generosity ever did. How did Europe's most welcoming country reach this point? To understand that, you have to go back to the autumn of 2015, to the moment when Sweden's self-image collided with reality. And to understand why that collision was so severe, you need to understand the scale of what happened. In 2015, Sweden registered approximately 163,000 asylum applications, the highest number in the nation's modern history. To put that in perspective, that single year accounted for 12% of all individuals seeking protection in the entire European Union. Sweden, a country of roughly 10 million people, absorbed more asylum seekers per capita than any other EU nation. No other country came close. The primary countries of origin tell the story of a world in crisis. Syria, 50,900 applications. Afghanistan, 42,100. And within that number, roughly 21,000 unaccompanied children. Children who arrived alone, without parents, without guardians, into a system that was already straining. Iraq, 21,000. These were not economic migrants looking for better wages. They were people fleeing war, persecution, and collapse. The influx was not gradual, it was a wave. Weekly applications surged from around 1,500 in July to over 9,000 by October. In just a few autumn months, 100,000 people arrived. The Swedish migration agency, Migrationsverket, described the situation as a humanitarian crisis that overwhelmed its capacity. Accommodation ran out. Emergency solutions appeared across the country. Tents, dormitories, repurposed office buildings, converted gymnasiums. Processing times stretched from months to years. The bureaucracy designed to handle thousands was now facing hundreds of thousands. By November 2015, Sweden introduced border controls and announced stricter asylum rules. Temporary residence permits replaced permanent ones. ID checks were imposed on travelers entering from Denmark. The open door, the door that had defined Sweden's identity for a generation, was closing, and it was closing fast. At the time, this response made sense. The system was physically overwhelmed. No country, regardless of its values, can absorb 163,000 asylum seekers in a single year without strain. The question was never whether Sweden would adjust. The question was how far the adjustment would go. The answer, further than anyone predicted. Because this was not a temporary adjustment. It was the beginning of a fundamental transformation. One that would take a decade to fully unfold. And one that would reshape not just policy, but the political landscape itself. To understand the scale of the reversal, consider what came next. In 2016, asylum applications dropped to 28,939, still significant, but an 82% decline from the year before. The emergency measures of November 2015, the border controls, the temporary permits, the ID checks were working. The flow was slowing. But the political consequences of 2015 were just beginning. The images of overwhelmed reception centers, the stories of tent cities in Swedish winters, the strain on schools and hospitals. These did not fade from public memory. They hardened into a new political reality. Something changed in Swedish politics after 2015. Not overnight, but decisively. The consensus that had held for decades that immigration was a moral good, that Sweden had a special responsibility, that openness was strength, fractured. Not among a fringe, among the mainstream. The center moved, and it moved to the right. In the 2022 general election, the Sweden Democrats became the second largest party in parliament. They won 20.5% of the popular vote, up from 17.5% in 2018. A party built on an anti-immigration platform, a party that had been treated as untouchable by the political establishment for years, was now the kingmaker of Swedish politics, not in government, but indispensable to it. The result was the Tidö Agreement, a coalition deal between the governing parties and the Sweden Democrats. Not a minor policy adjustment, not a compromise, a self-described paradigm shift. The stated goal was explicit: reduce immigration to the minimum level permitted by EU law. Not reduce it somewhat, reduce it to the legal floor, and the public agreed. A survey found that 73% of Swedish respondents believe immigration levels over the past decade have been too high. Not a slim majority, not a contested finding. Nearly 3/4 of the population had reached the same conclusion. The numbers reflect this shift with mathematical precision. Asylum applications dropped from 28,939 in 2016 to 9,634 in 2024, a decline of over 66%. 2/3 of the demand gone. And in the first 5 months of 2023, something happened that had not occurred in modern Swedish history. More people left Sweden than arrived. Negative net migration. For a country that had defined itself through immigration for decades, that is not a statistic. It is a structural reversal, a before and after moment. But reducing new arrivals was only half the strategy. The other half targeted those already in the country. And this is where the policy architecture becomes truly systematic. Not one measure, a cascade. Start with residence permits. Since 2021, the default is temporary, not permanent. Permanent residency now requires holding a temporary permit for at least 3 years, plus demonstrated self-sufficiency and good conduct. The era of arriving and staying permanently is over. But the government went further. An inquiry proposed revoking permanent residence permits that had already been granted on asylum-related grounds, not future permits, existing ones. The potential scope of that single measure: up to 185,000 people who thought their status was secure. The proposed effective date: January 1st, 2027. Family reunification, once a cornerstone of Sweden's humanitarian approach, the principle that families should not be separated now carries strict income and housing requirements for sponsors. New regulations in 2024 raised the bar. Since December 2023, a residence permit can be denied if a spouse or partner is under 21. Beneficiaries of subsidiary protection lost their exemption from maintenance requirements. The message is clear: reunification is no longer a right. It is conditional, and the conditions are designed to be difficult to meet. Two systems that defined Sweden's flexible humanitarian approach were dismantled entirely. The EBO law, Eget Benda, which allowed asylum seekers to arrange their own housing rather than live in state-assigned accommodation, was abolished on March 1st, 2025. The track change system, which let rejected asylum seekers apply for work permits without leaving Sweden first, was abolished on April 1st, 2025. Both pathways gone within a single month of each other. Two pillars of the old system removed. And then the headline measure, the one that made international news, the voluntary return grant. Starting in 2026, immigrants who choose to leave Sweden can receive up to 350,000 Swedish kroner, approximately $34,000. The previous family cap was 40,000 Swedish kroner. That is nearly a ninefold increase. From a token gesture that few took seriously to a serious financial incentive that changes the calculation for thousands of families. The changes extend to citizenship itself. A proposal would increase the residency requirement from 5 to 8 years, with stricter criteria for good conduct and self-support. 5 to 8, a 60% increase in the time required to become Swedish. And for those who already hold Swedish citizenship, the government is pursuing constitutional changes to allow revocation. The targets: individuals who obtain citizenship fraudulently, pose a serious threat to national security, or are involved in severe organized crime. An inquiry on this is expected to report by March 20th, 2026. Sweden is not just making it harder to arrive, it is making it possible to undo arrival entirely. One proposal drew particular resistance: a law that would have required public sector employees, teachers, doctors, social workers, to report undocumented individuals to authorities, the so-called informant law. The backlash was immediate and widespread. Medical professionals argued it would prevent undocumented people from seeking health care. Teachers warned it would drive children out of schools. Unions mobilized. A government inquiry recommended exemptions for schools, healthcare, and social services. The government agreed to the exemptions. This single concession reveals the tension at the heart of Sweden's transformation. The political will to restrict exists. The public mandate is clear, 73% clear. But the institutional resistance from the very people who run Sweden's welfare state, the teachers and doctors and social workers, is real. The system is changing, but it is not changing without friction. And that friction defines the limits of how far the transformation can go. Today, Sweden operates a migration system that would have been unrecognizable a decade ago. Not just different, unrecognizable. The philosophical foundation has shifted. The legal framework has been rebuilt. The political consensus has inverted. The country that registered 163,000 asylum seekers in a single year now processes fewer than 10,000 applications annually. The country that offered permanent residency as standard now defaults to temporary permits, and proposes revoking existing ones. The country that celebrated family reunification as a humanitarian principle now imposes income thresholds, housing requirements, and age minimums. The country that created pathways for rejected asylum seekers, allowing them to stay, to work, to build lives, now abolishes those pathways entirely. Consider the human dimension of these numbers. Of the 163,000 who arrived in 2015, nearly 66,000 have obtained Swedish citizenship. They are legally Swedish. Approximately 39,000 are registered as having departed the country, and the rest, tens of thousands of people, exist somewhere in between, in a system that is actively being redesigned around them. The 2015 cohort arrived in a Sweden that welcomed them. The Sweden Democrats, still not formally in the cabinet, provide the confidence and supply that keeps the coalition in power. The question is whether this represents a correction or an overcorrection. Sweden's asylum applications have dropped 66% since 2016. Net migration turned negative. The voluntary return grant increased nearly ninefold. Permanent permits face revocation. Citizenship requirements are being tightened. They represent the most comprehensive reversal of immigration policy in modern European history. From 163,000 asylum seekers in a single year to fewer than 10,000. From permanent residency as default to temporary permits as standard. From welcoming refugees to offering them $34,000 to leave. The timeline tells the story. 2015, record asylum intake. 2016, emergency restrictions. 2022, the Sweden Democrats become kingmakers. 2026, the $34,000 voluntary return grant takes effect. Sweden's transformation is not about one policy. It is not about one election. It is about a country discovering that identity and mathematics do not always align. For decades, Sweden defined itself through openness. That openness created a system the country could not sustain. And the correction, the tightened permits, the abolished pathways, the revoked residencies, the $34,000 checks, is not a rejection of values. It is the cost of discovering their limits. Sweden was Europe's humanitarian champion. Today, it pays people to leave.